energy out before we start our lesson. Let's play Mrs. Coon Says. Find a spot somewhere in your house where you can move around a little bit. You ready? Hey, Mrs. Coon says hop 3 times. Mrs. Coon says put your hands on your shoulders. Mrs. Coon says touch your knees. Mrs. Coon says touch an elbow. Mrs. Coon says touch your other elbow. Mrs. Coon says touch your ears. Now touch your head. Oh, Mrs. Coon didn't say. Let's start over. Hey, Mrs. Coon says clap 5 times. Mrs. Coon says touch your knees. Mrs. Coon says stomp 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now touch your shoulders. Whoop! Mrs. Coon didn't say. Hey, let's start over. Mrs. Coon says touch your knees. Mrs. Coon says touch your head. Mrs. Coon says twirl around 2 times. Woo! Mrs. Coon says touch your elbow. Mrs. Coon says touch your nose. Mrs. Coon says touch your knees. Mrs. Coon says touch your head. Mrs. Coon says clap 5 times. Mrs. Coon says take a big breath in and out. Well, now you're going to go on to the next slide, and you are going to work on a really cool breathing video. I think you're going to enjoy. So now it's time to calm down. We'll do our mindful minute with our breathing, and then we'll get to our learning. Thank you for joining me.